The snow started falling just after 6 in the evening, and it didn't fall gently. It came sideways, sharp and mean, cutting through the thin jackets of the people hurrying along the sidewalk outside the Maple Street diner. Inside, the windows had fogged up from the heat of the kitchen, and the smell of coffee and fried onions hung thick in the warm air. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in 30 years. Cracked vinyl seats, laminated menus, a jukebox in the corner that nobody ever touched. But on this particular Tuesday evening, something was about to happen inside those walls that would change two lives forever. Victoria Sterling sat alone in the corner booth. She wore a plain gray coat, no jewelry, hair pulled back in a way that made her look like any other tired professional grabbing a late dinner. No one in the diner recognized her. That was the point. Victoria owned 47 businesses across 3 countries, and once every few months she walked into one of them unannounced, sat down and watched. Not the numbers. Not the spreadsheets. The people. Because Victoria had learned long ago that a company's real health showed up not in the quarterly reports but in the face of the employee who thought no one important was watching. She ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie she didn't plan to eat. And then she noticed the waiter. He was young, 19 maybe 20 at most, with dark circles under his eyes that told a story all on their own. He moved through the crowded diner with a kind of focused efficiency that Victoria recognized immediately. Not the lazy rhythm of someone counting down the hours. This was the movement of a person who couldn't afford to make a mistake. He cleared tables faster than anyone else on the floor. He remembered orders without writing them down. He smiled at customers even when they were rude, which happened twice in the first 20 minutes Victoria watched him. And yet every 30 minutes, almost exactly to the minute, he disappeared through the swinging door at the back of the restaurant and didn't return for 3 or 4 minutes. The first time it happened, Victoria assumed he was checking his phone. The second time she set her coffee cup down and watched the clock. The third time she leaned forward slightly in her booth. Because the young waiter, whoever he was, looked terrified every single time he came back through that door. Not anxious the way a person looks when they're behind on their orders. Terrified the way a person looks when something fragile is sitting just out of reach and they're praying it doesn't fall. Victoria didn't know what was in that back room. But she had built half her fortune on learning to ask exactly the right questions at exactly the right moment. And right now, every instinct she had was telling her to stay very, very still and keep watching. She didn't have to wait long. It happened near the end of the dinner rush, when the noise in the diner was at its peak and the kitchen was running 3 orders behind. The young waiter had just delivered a basket of bread to the table by the window when the restaurant manager appeared at the back of the room. His name was Carl Benson, and Victoria knew him from his personnel file. 12 years with the company, consistent reviews, a man who prided himself on running a tight operation. Carl was scanning the floor with the expression of someone who had just noticed something he didn't like. He moved toward the back room. The young waiter saw him too. His face changed. Just for a second, just a flicker, but Victoria caught it. His hand tightened around the bread basket. His jaw clenched. His eyes tracked Carl across the room the way a person watches an approaching storm. Then Carl disappeared through the swinging door. For 5 seconds the diner was just a diner. Plates clinking. A child at table 4 asking for more ketchup. The jukebox not playing anything. Then the shouting started. It came through the walls muffled at first, and then Carl's voice broke through sharp and loud enough that the whole room went quiet. The couple by the window looked up. The family at table 4 stopped eating. The 2 waitresses on the floor froze where they stood. And then Carl Benson pushed through the swinging door and came onto the dining floor, and he had the young waiter by the arm, and behind them both, standing in the doorway of the storage room, clutching a worn navy backpack to her chest, was a little girl. She was 8 years old maybe. Small for her age. She had the same dark eyes as the young waiter, and her hair was pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that someone had clearly tried their best to make neat. She was wearing a coat that was just slightly too big for her and sneakers that were starting to come apart at the toe. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just stood in that doorway and looked out at the restaurant full of strangers staring at her, and her expression was completely, heartbreakingly calm. Like a child who had already learned that crying didn't change anything. The entire diner held its breath. Carl's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He demanded to know what the girl was doing in the storage room. He wanted an explanation right now in front of everyone. The young waiter, Ethan, his name tag said Ethan Parker, tried to step between Carl and the doorway where his sister stood. He kept his voice low. He was asking Carl to take this somewhere private. He was asking and then he was pleading and Carl wasn't interested in either. So the whole room heard it. Ethan's mother had died 6 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal, the kind that gave you barely enough time to say goodbye. Their father had left when Ethan was 12 and Lily was 3, and no one had heard from him since. Ethan had dropped out of college to take care of his mother through treatment, and then to take care of Lily when the treatment stopped working. He had gotten this job 3 months ago because the diner was 2 bus stops from Lily's school and his shift started after drop-off. That morning, the school had closed without warning. A burst water pipe in the basement had flooded the hallways overnight. The babysitter Ethan used for emergencies had texted at 7 a.m. to say she had a family situation and couldn't come. Ethan had called 4 other people. None of them answered. He had $45 in his bank account. If he missed the shift, he wouldn't make rent. And social services had already been by the apartment twice, asking questions about whether Ethan was a stable enough guardian for an 8-year-old. One more stumble and they were talking about temporary placement. He had no choice. He brought Lily in through the back door before his shift started, settled her in the storage room with her backpack and a sandwich and a drawing book, and checked on her every 30 minutes to make sure she was okay. He had planned to keep it quiet for just one shift. Just this one time. Carl Benson listened to all of this. Then he fired Ethan on the spot. He said it clearly, loudly, in front of every customer and every staff member in the diner. He said bringing an unauthorized individual onto the premises was a violation of company policy. He said he didn't care about the circumstances. He said Ethan needed to collect his things and leave the property immediately. One of the waitresses at the counter said quietly, "Carl, come on." Carl told her to get back to work. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just nodded once, the way a person nods when they've already been broken so many times that one more break doesn't even register the same way anymore. He thanked the waitress who had spoken up. He apologized to the cook who had been covering the food runner station during the commotion. He walked to the back and when he came out again he was carrying Lily's backpack over one shoulder and holding her hand with his other hand, and he walked them both toward the front door of the diner. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said a word. Lily looked up at her brother once, just before they pushed through the glass door into the snow, and Ethan looked down at her and said something quiet that nobody else could hear. Whatever it was made her nod and pull her coat tighter around herself. And then they were outside and the glass door swung shut behind them and the snow swallowed them up. Victoria was already on her feet. She left 2 20s on the table without looking at them. She pulled on her coat as she moved through the diner. At the door she paused and she turned back and she looked at Carl Benson for exactly 2 seconds. Carl met her eyes and then looked away the way people sometimes do when they feel a cold draft from somewhere they can't identify. Then Victoria went out into the snow. She kept her distance. A half-block back, close enough to keep them in sight, far enough that they wouldn't notice. She wasn't sure why she was following them. Victoria Sterling did not, as a rule, make decisions based on gut feelings. She made decisions based on data, on analysis, on carefully constructed logic. But there was something about the little girl who hadn't cried that she couldn't leave alone. She thought they were heading for a bus stop. Then she thought they were heading for a friend's apartment. Then Ethan turned down a side street that ran behind a closed auto parts warehouse, and Victoria followed at a careful distance, and when she rounded the corner she stopped walking. Parked against the far wall of the warehouse, half hidden under a rusted awning, was a dark blue cargo van. It was old, early 2000s maybe, with a cracked right headlight and a rear window covered on the inside with a piece of cardboard. Ethan produced a key from his coat pocket. He unlocked the side panel door. He lifted Lily inside first, then climbed in after her. The door slid shut with a sound that echoed off the warehouse wall. A dim light came on inside the van. Victoria stood on the sidewalk in the snow and stared. She had grown up poor. She knew what poverty looked like and she knew what it felt like, and she had spent most of her adult life trying to build systems that reached the people who fell through every other net. But there was something about seeing a light come on inside a van on a freezing night, knowing that a 19-year-old and his 8-year-old sister were on the other side of that thin metal wall, that broke through every professional distance she had ever built up around herself. She stood there for a long time. When she finally turned and walked back to her car, her hands were shaking. Not from the cold. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen island in her apartment with a cup of tea that went cold and her laptop open in front of her, and she dug into every piece of publicly available information she could find on Ethan Parker. It took her about 2 hours to build a picture clear enough to understand. Before his mother got sick, Ethan had been exceptional. He had attended Westfield Community College on a full academic scholarship, the first in his family to go to college at all. He had been in the engineering program, the kind of student his professors talked about in those quiet ways that professors reserve for students who show up once every few years. He had won the state robotics competition in his sophomore year with a machine he'd designed himself, built from components he'd sourced secondhand. His project advisor had written in a letter of recommendation that Ethan had a quality that couldn't be taught and rarely be found: the ability to see the simplest solution to the most complex problem. Then his mother's diagnosis came in. Ethan withdrew from classes 3 weeks later. The scholarship lapsed when he missed the enrollment deadline the following semester. By the time his mother passed, the medical bills had consumed everything the family had. The apartment they'd been renting went next. And then it was just Ethan and Lily in a van that barely started in cold weather. Victoria closed her laptop at 4 in the morning. She sat in the dark for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called her assistant and told him she needed a file prepared for a meeting first thing Thursday morning. When he asked what the meeting was about, she said she'd explain when she got there. Then she hung up and finally went to bed. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the address on Ethan's last employment form, a cousin's apartment where he'd been using the address for mail. Inside the envelope was a single card on heavy cream paper. It said, "Your presence is requested at Sterling Technologies headquarters, 14 Commerce Plaza, Thursday at 10 a.m. Ask for Suite 12. Versus." Ethan read it 3 times. He was certain it was a mistake. He almost threw it away. He held it over the recycling bin in his cousin's kitchen for a full 30 seconds before something, curiosity maybe, or just the fact that he had nothing to lose, made him pull his hand back. On Thursday morning he borrowed his cousin's jacket because it was warmer than his, walked Lily to a friend's apartment, and took 2 buses to Commerce Plaza. The building was glass and steel, 40 stories, with a lobby that had a waterfall feature and a marble floor and a security guard who looked at Ethan's card and then at Ethan's jacket and then at the card again before making a call. They sent someone down to escort him up. The elevator opened onto a hallway with actual artwork on the walls. Not prints. Paintings. Ethan kept his hands in his pockets and followed the assistant and tried not to look like what he was: a 19-year-old who'd been sleeping in a van for 3 months in a borrowed jacket that was slightly too big in the shoulders. The assistant opened a door to a conference room. And Ethan Parker walked in and came face to face with the woman from the corner booth at the Maple Street diner. He stopped walking. His brain ran through the moment twice before it caught up to what his eyes were already telling him. The woman sitting at the head of the long conference table was the same woman who had been eating apple pie in the corner booth 2 nights ago. He was absolutely certain of it. Same face. Same quality of stillness about her. That thing she had where she seemed to be watching everything at once without appearing to move. Except she wasn't wearing a plain gray coat now. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and there was a glass of water in front of her, and behind her on the wall was a logo he'd seen on 3 different tech news sites in the last year alone. Sterling Technologies. He'd read an article about their new energy storage program just last month, sitting in the van using the public library's Wi-Fi on his phone. He said, and his voice was completely steady in a way that surprised him, "You were at the diner." Victoria said, "I was." "You own it." Among other things. He stood there. "You followed us," he said. She didn't apologize for it. She said, "Sit down, Ethan." He considered the door. Then he considered the fact that he had 2 bus fares left on his transit card and $41 in his account and a sister who needed a winter coat that actually fit. He sat down. He expected her to offer him his job back. He had decided on the walkover that he would say no, that going back to work for Carl Benson after being humiliated in front of an entire restaurant wasn't something he was willing to do, not even for the income. He had some things left, and one of them was the ability to decide what he wouldn't accept. He did not expect what she actually said. Victoria told him that 6 months ago, Sterling Technologies had purchased a decommissioned manufacturing facility on the east side of the city. The plan was to convert it into an innovation center, a place where young engineers and inventors could develop products, receive mentorship, and have access to equipment and funding that most of them would never be able to afford on their own. She had been looking for the right person to lead the build-out of the program. Not to run the financials. Not to manage the construction. But to actually design the program, to figure out what it should be, who it should serve, how it should work. Someone who understood from the inside what it meant to have ability without access. She slid a folder across the table toward him. That's the position, she said. Salary, benefits, housing stipend included until you're settled. There's a school partnership attached to it that would let you complete your degree while working. And the role comes with a seat on the center's founding board. Ethan looked at the folder. He didn't open it. He said, "Why me?" Victoria said, "Because I watched you work for 3 hours and I saw someone who takes care of things. That's rarer than a degree." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ethan said, "No." The assistant standing near the wall made a small sound. Victoria didn't react. She looked at Ethan and waited. He said, I'm not trying to be rude. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. "If this goes wrong, it's not just me. You understand? It's never just me anymore. If I fail at this, if I'm not what you think I am and the whole thing falls apart, Lily pays for that. She's been through enough." He looked up. "And good things that show up this fast usually cost something I can't see yet." It was the most honest thing he'd said out loud to anyone in months. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something I've never put in a press release?" He nodded. She told him that when she was 16, both of her parents had died within 8 months of each other. Her father from a heart attack, her mother from grief. Or that's how Victoria had always understood it. She had spent 14 months in a shelter on the north side of the city. Not a van, but close enough that the cold was the same and the uncertainty was the same and the particular loneliness of not having a real address was the same. She had been smart like Ethan. She had been driven. And it hadn't mattered because without resources, drive just meant you got really good at surviving. Then a woman named Ruth Chin, who ran an adult education program out of the basement of a church, had applied for a grant on Victoria's behalf without telling her. The grant had paid for 2 years of community college. Those 2 years had unlocked everything else. "I never paid Ruth back," Victoria said. "She wouldn't let me. She said the way you pay something like that back is forward." She looked at Ethan steadily. "I've been trying to do that for 23 years. Sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I find the right person at the right moment." She paused. "I think you're the right person." Ethan looked at the folder on the table. He thought about the van. About Lily doing her homework on a sleeping bag with a flashlight because the dome light ran the battery down. About the way she'd looked in the doorway of the storage room, not crying, just waiting the way she always waited. He thought about the robotics competition. About the way it had felt to build something from nothing and watch it work. He opened the folder. That was the beginning. What followed was not easy and Victoria never told him it would be. The first 3 months were a crash course in things Ethan had never had to think about. Board presentations, budget proposals, vendor negotiations, the particular language of institutional funding. He was 20 years old with no degree and no professional history, walking into rooms full of people who had both, and some of them were gracious about it and some of them were not. There were nights he called Victoria at 10 p.m. and said he needed to go over something for the 3rd time because he still didn't understand it, and she always answered and always went over it with him without making him feel small for asking. He learned, and he learned fast because Ethan Parker had always learned fast when someone gave him the actual tools. Victoria arranged a furnished apartment for him and Lily on a month-to-month basis initially, then transitioned it to a rental agreement under Ethan's name once he had 2 paychecks on record. She set up an education trust for Lily, not a token amount but a full fund covering school through college, administered independently so that no change in circumstances could touch it. She brought in tutors to help Ethan re-enter his coursework. She coordinated childcare support so that the evenings when Ethan had evening classes or late meetings, Lily had somewhere safe and consistent to be. And then she did something the board didn't expect. He went back to the diner. Not as a disguised owner this time. As the CEO of Sterling Technologies. She sat across from the company's management team and she told them that what she had witnessed in that restaurant, a dedicated employee humiliated in public for trying to take care of a child, was a failure of company culture and she was not going to let it stand. She worked with HR to design a family emergency protocol, paid leave coordination with childcare services, a discreet way for employees to flag that they had a dependent situation. The program went into effect across all 47 properties within 6 months. Carl Benson was offered a transfer. He took it. The board told Victoria the program would cost money. She told them she was aware. They told her it would be difficult to implement consistently. She told them that was why they were going to build it carefully, and she'd handle the implementation personally if she had to. They knew her well enough by then to understand that when she said she'd handle something personally, she meant it. He meant it. The Innovation Center opened its doors 14 months after Ethan had sat across from Victoria in that conference room. It was called the Foundry, because, as Ethan explained to the local paper in its first piece about the launch, a foundry is a place where raw material gets turned into something that can build other things. The reporter asked him what he meant. Ethan said, "I mean that talent is everywhere. Resources are not. The foundry is trying to close that gap." The piece ran on a Sunday. By Tuesday they had 400 applications from young people across the city. In the 2 years that followed, the foundry placed engineers and inventors in internships, startup incubators and college programs they would never have been able to access on their own. It partnered with 3 universities to create accelerated pathways for working adults with dependents. It built a childcare facility on site because Ethan had argued in a board meeting that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled that you could not build an innovation center for people with dependents and then not address the question of who watches the kids. The board approved it. Ethan completed his engineering degree 22 months into his tenure at Sterling Technologies. He walked across the stage at the college's commencement ceremony, and in the crowd, sitting in a folding chair in the 3rd row, was Lily in a yellow dress she'd picked herself, clapping louder than anyone around her. 3 years after a freezing Tuesday evening in a roadside diner, the city announced the opening of a new national technology campus, a permanent multi-building facility that would serve as the flagship expansion of the Foundry model to communities across the country. It was the largest initiative of its kind, and its grand opening drew guests from the business community, the education sector, and city government. They filled a glass atrium that looked out over a courtyard where a sculpture of 2 interlocked gears caught the afternoon light. Ethan Parker walked onto the stage. He was 22 years old. He stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at him, and for a moment he was quiet in a way that wasn't uncertainty. It was just someone taking a second to be exactly where they were. He spoke for 20 minutes. He talked about his mother who had wanted him to be an engineer. He talked about his father, only to say that some people leave and you have to decide whether their leaving defines you. He talked about a van and a flashlight and a drawing book and a little girl who never complained. He talked about what it meant to be seen at the moment you were most invisible. Not fixed, not solved, just seen. He talked about Ruth Chin, a woman he'd never met, who had paid something forward that eventually reached him in a roundabout way through a woman in a gray coat eating apple pie she didn't intend to finish. And then he said there was one more thing he wanted to share before he introduced the next speaker. He reached down to the podium and picked up a piece of paper. He said that every year the national campus would provide full scholarships, on-site housing assistance, and mentorship for young people who were primary caregivers for younger siblings. Not a handful of spots. Not a pilot program. A permanent, funded initiative, administered by an independent board, with a mandate to grow every year. He said the program had a name. He said it was called the Lily Initiative. In the 3rd row of the front section, an 11-year-old girl in a blue dress put both hands over her mouth. The room was on its feet before Ethan finished the sentence. Victoria Sterling sat in the 2nd row and felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name. She had been to hundreds of these events. She had funded programs that had reached thousands of people. She was not by nature someone who cried in public, and she had always considered that a professional strength. She was crying now. She didn't try to stop. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to move toward the reception area, Lily appeared at Victoria's side. She was carrying something, a small frame about the size of a piece of notebook paper, wrapped in tissue paper that she had clearly wrapped herself, with too much tape and not quite enough paper. She held it out without saying anything at first. When Victoria took it and unwrapped it, she found a photograph printed on copy paper and slid inside a frame from a dollar store. It was a picture of a dark blue cargo van, taken from outside, parked against a warehouse wall in what looked like a winter evening. Someone had driven past the right building at the right time of day to catch it in the fading light. Victoria turned the frame over. On the back, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, were 2 sentences. Most people saw a waiter who broke the rules. You saw a family worth saving. Victoria looked at the words for a long time. Around her, the atrium filled with sound, conversation and laughter and the kind of ambient noise that belongs to rooms full of people who have somewhere to be and reasons to be there. Lily stood beside her, waiting in the way that Lily had always waited, patient and still and somehow completely at ease with silence. Victoria had built a company from a grant someone had given her when she was nobody. She had sat in boardrooms and city halls and convinced people to bet on things that looked impossible. She had made decisions that affected thousands of people and she had gotten some of them right and some of them wrong and she had kept going either way because that was the job. She had never once in 23 years found herself completely without words. She found herself there now. She lowered the frame. She looked at Lily. And then she did something that the people standing nearby would talk about later. Not because it was dramatic but because it was small and quiet and completely real. She put one arm around the 11-year-old's shoulders and held on for a moment. And Lily leaned in, and for just a second the CEO of Sterling Technologies and the little girl from the storage room stood together in the middle of the loudest room in the building and were perfectly still. Then Ethan appeared through the crowd and someone was pulling at his sleeve asking for a photo, and Lily pulled away and rolled her eyes at her brother in the universal language of little sisters, and the moment broke open into ordinary life again. But Victoria held on to the frame. Later, much later, when the event had ended and the guests had gone and Victoria sat in the back of her car on the way home, she held the frame in both hands in the dark and read those two sentences one more time. She thought about Ruth Chen's voice on the phone, which she'd heard only once years after the fact, when Victoria had tracked her down to thank her. Ruth had said in a voice that suggested she'd had this conversation before, that she hadn't done anything except notice. That most of what people call generosity is just paying attention. Victoria looked out the window at the city going by. Somewhere on the east side the foundry's lights were still on. They were always still on. Ethan had installed a policy that the building stayed open until midnight for residents who worked day jobs and needed the evening hours. Victoria had told him it would be expensive. He had told her that was the point. She had looked at him across the table in that familiar way and said fine and signed the budget line. She thought about what came next. The national expansion was funded and the board was aligned and the Lily Initiative would begin its first intake in the fall. Everything was in place. The work was working. And yet, there was a number on her phone that she hadn't called yet. A woman named Dr. Anita Reeves, who ran a network of youth advocacy organizations in 7 cities and who had reached out 2 weeks ago about a conversation she wanted to have. Victoria had read the message and flagged it and told herself she'd respond after the opening. She picked up her phone. She pulled up the message and read it again. Dr. Reeves had written, "I've been following what you're building with the foundry. There's something I'd like to show you, a situation in our network that I think you'd want to know about. I can't say more in a message. Would you be willing to meet?" Victoria stared at the message for a long time. She had learned, over 23 years, to trust the particular feeling that came when she was standing at the edge of something that hadn't happened yet. Not optimism. Not certainty. Something more like recognition, the feeling of a door that was asking to be opened. She started typing a reply. She wrote, "I'm listening. Tell me where." Then she stopped. Her thumb hovered over the send button. Because she had also learned, over 23 years, that some doors were heavier than they looked. That some conversations changed things in ways you couldn't prepare for. That paying attention. Really paying attention the way Ruth Chen had paid attention, the way Victoria had paid attention in a corner booth on a freezing Tuesday, always cost something and the cost wasn't always money. She sat in the back of the car with her thumb over the button and the frame in her lap and the city moving past the window, and for just a moment the most decisive person in any room she had ever walked into sat with the weight of what she was about to do. Outside, the city lights blurred in the glass. Victoria Sterling pressed send.